At 8:14 a.m., Thursday, November 23, 1995, a call comes in from a Manhattan apartment building. A neighbor asking for help. Inside one bedroom, on a narrow bed, lies a 6-year-old girl named Elisa Izquierdo. She is fully dressed. Her hair neatly cut. The room unusually quiet. By the time police arrive, Elisa has been dead for hours. What they are about to see will stay with them for the rest of their careers. But that moment is not the beginning of this story. To understand how Elisa died, you have to go back to a time when she was still laughing. Born on February 11, 1989, Elisa entered a world already watching her. Doctors noticed. Social workers documented. Decisions were made about where she should live, and who should be trusted with her life. For a while those decisions worked. Elisa had a father who adored her. Teachers who described her as gentle. A small window of safety that made her feel seen. Then, in November 1991, that window quietly closed. A judgment call was made. A risk was accepted. And a child was sent back into a home she did not yet know how to survive. Over the next few years, signs began to appear. Not all at once. Not loudly. A bruise explained away. Child afraid to go home. A report written, then another. People noticed. Files grew thicker. And Elisa kept waiting for something to change. On the night of November 22, 1995, her body reached a point it could not recover from. By morning, the system that had followed Elisa her entire life would finally be forced to confront what it had missed. And the question that would linger long after the headlines faded was not who hurt her, but how so many chances to protect her were allowed to pass. In the early hours of Saturday, February 11, 1989, at Woodhull Hospital in Brooklyn, a baby girl entered the world quietly. Her name was Elisa Izquierdo. The delivery room was calm, but the mood was not. Nurses moved with care. Doctors spoke in lowered voices, and charts began to fill almost immediately. In the reception hall, the TV was on with Oregon versus James Madison showing. Elisa was small, newly born, unaware that concern had already settled around her like a shadow. Her mother, Awilda Lopez, had struggled with addiction for years, and it had not stopped during pregnancy. The medical staff did not speculate. They observed. They noted signs consistent with substance exposure. They followed protocol. Before Elisa was even cleaned and wrapped, her situation had been identified as fragile. This was not a child slipping through unnoticed. From her first breath she was seen. Awilda was already known to the system. By the time Elisa was born, Awilda had lost custody of her older children because of her drug use. That history mattered. It shaped how professionals viewed this newborn and how quickly decisions were made. Hospital staff contacted child welfare authorities within hours. Social workers reviewed records, spoke with doctors, and weighed immediate risk. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, just a quiet understanding that Elisa could not safely leave the hospital in her mother's care. The decision came swiftly. Custody would go to Gustavo Izquierdo, Elisa's father, a man living on the margins himself, but one who showed concern, presence, and a willingness to try. In that moment the system acted decisively. It placed Elisa somewhere safer, believing it had done the right thing. Elisa left Woodhull Hospital not just as a newborn, but as a child already being watched. Home visits were planned. Notes were written. Her life unfolded under supervision, guided by assessments and follow-ups meant to prevent harm before it began. To those involved, this was how protection worked. Identify risk early, intervene, monitor. On paper, Elisa's case was active, visible, managed. She was a baby whose safety had been discussed in offices and documented in files. A child whose future was already shaped by adults making judgments about who could be trusted and who could not. And yet, beneath the structure and oversight, something fragile remained. Protection depended on consistency, on vigilance, on the belief that danger does not always disappear just because it pauses. Elisa could not know that her safety rested on decisions that might one day be reversed. She could not know that the same system that moved quickly to protect her at birth would later hesitate. All she knew in those earliest days was touch, warmth, and the simple need to be held. Before Elisa Izquierdo was known to social workers and case files, she was known to one man simply as his daughter. Gustavo Izquierdo had come to the United States from Cuba years earlier, carrying the quiet determination of someone who understood loss and displacement. By the late 1980s, he was living in New York City, moving between temporary spaces, doing the kind of work that rarely brought stability. It was inside a homeless shelter in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, that he met Awilda Lopez. Their relationship was brief and unsteady, shaped by survival rather than certainty. When Awilda became pregnant, Gustavo did not have answers, but when Elisa was born on February 11, 1989, he made a decision that would define him. He would not walk away. When child welfare authorities removed Elisa from her mother's care shortly after birth, custody was granted to Gustavo. It was not because his life was secure. It was because he showed up consistently. He asked what Elisa needed. He listened when professionals spoke. He accepted help without defensiveness, often admitting he was learning as he went. Gustavo brought Elisa into small apartments furnished with little more than necessity. He worked around her schedule, learned how to warm bottles properly, memorized the sound of her cries, and developed a habit of holding her a second longer before putting her down, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go too soon. As Elisa grew, Gustavo built routines that anchored her. Morning walks, simple meals, the same bedtime rhythm each night. Neighbors would later remember seeing him carrying her through the neighborhood. Her hand wrapped tightly around his finger, her face turned upward whenever he spoke. He called her his princess, not as a joke, but as a promise. Despite limited resources, he marked her birthdays with care, inviting relatives when he could, making sure she felt seen. In a world that had already labeled her vulnerable, Gustavo treated her as treasured. By the early 1990s, Elisa was enrolled in preschool. Teachers noticed her immediately. Not because she struggled, but because she did not. She was gentle with other children. She offered comfort easily. She laughed often and without hesitation. She was affectionate, trusting, and eager to please, the kind of child who sought approval not out of fear, but from a sense of belonging. There were no signs of distress then. No flinching. No withdrawal. When the school day ended, Elisa ran toward her father without hesitation, confident about who would be waiting for her. During these years, the child welfare system continued to monitor Elisa's situation, but there were no alarms. Reports were routine. Home visits uneventful. On paper, her case appeared stable. In real life, she was experiencing something rare and fragile: consistency. She knew where she slept. She knew who loved her. She knew what tomorrow would look like. It would not last. But for a brief moment in her short life, before decisions were reconsidered and assumptions made, Elisa Izquierdo knew what safety felt like. In November 1991, Elisa Izquierdo's case came up for review again, the way cases do when time has passed and nothing appears to be wrong. She was nearly 3 years old. There were no fresh injuries documented. No emergency calls. No visible crisis demanding immediate action. On paper, her life looked settled. And in systems built around progress reports and outcomes, calm is often mistaken for resolution. Around this time, Awilda Lopez began telling child welfare officials that she was sober. She spoke of change with confidence. She described stability. She said she was ready. These claims were not unusual. Reunification was the goal written into the framework of child protection. Parents were expected to improve. Children were expected to return home. The idea itself was not reckless. What mattered was how carefully it was tested. A social worker evaluated the case. Meetings took place. Observations were made during controlled interactions. Awilda presented well. She said the right things. And without extended monitoring, without long-term verification of sobriety beyond limited check-ins, her claim was accepted. The system relied on what could be observed in brief moments, not what might surface under pressure. Risk was recalculated. Oversight softened. And then, quietly, approval was given for unsupervised care. There was no dramatic transfer, no raised voices, no hesitation recorded in the file. Elisa was moved back into her mother's custody as if this were simply the next step, not a rupture. She was too young to understand what was happening, only that the rhythms of her life were shifting. The person who had always been there was no longer the one she woke up with each morning. The routines she trusted dissolved without explanation. At an age when children rely on consistency to feel safe, Elisa was expected to adjust. To the system, this was reunification, a process completed. To Elisa, it was displacement. There was no follow-up that matched the weight of the decision. No sustained observation of how Awilda handled stress when no one was watching. No safety net ready to catch Elisa if something went wrong. The assumption was that improvement, once declared, would hold. And with that assumption, the watchful distance between Elisa and harm narrowed. This was the moment everything turned. Not with violence, not with chaos, but with trust placed too easily, and caution set aside. What followed would not happen all at once. It would unfold quietly, behind doors that no longer opened to scrutiny. And it would all trace back to this decision in November 1991, when a judgment was signed, a child was handed over, and the safeguards that once surrounded Elisa Izquierdo quietly fell away. One signature, one unchecked assumption, one irreversible mistake. After Elisa Izquierdo was returned to her mother's care in late 1991, the shift in her life was quiet at first. There were no emergency calls, no hospital visits, no flashing alarms to demand attention. But small, insistent changes began to ripple through her days, subtle enough to be overlooked, yet sharp enough to be felt by those paying close attention. Relatives visiting the home noticed how she was treated differently. Tasks that once passed unnoticed now seemed to single her out. A look, a sharp word, a punishment that lingered longer than necessary. These were the threads of a pattern forming. Her older siblings watched too. They saw how she flinched when voices rose, how her small body recoiled when discipline landed. They whispered their worries in corners of rooms, shared quiet fears with cousins and aunts. But no one reached beyond the family. The children had no power to intervene, and the adults were caught between concern and the assumption that this was just parenting. The signs that would have alarmed authorities remained contained, observed but unreported. Elisa's world began to narrow. Punishments were no longer occasional. They became routine. Physical strikes were paired with isolation. She spent hours separated from play, from laughter, from the simple comfort of touch. Meals, once shared at a table, became moments where she was alone. And yet she tried to adapt. She learned which words would not provoke anger, which actions would avoid punishment. At 3 and 4 years old, she already understood the weight of watching eyes, the consequences of missteps she could barely articulate. A bruise faded beneath clothing. A glance of disapproval passed unremarked by neighbors. The home became a theater of control, and Elisa's life was performed quietly, constantly, under scrutiny she could not name. Time passed. Weeks turned to months. Birthdays came and went, each one marking another year in which the system that had once surrounded her with supervision remained distant. The warnings multiplied. Small injuries, withdrawn behavior, sibling whispers, neighbors' murmurs. But no formal action followed. Observers saw, but the mechanisms of intervention were never engaged. In these early years, the signals were clear to anyone looking closely. The danger was present, persistent, unavoidable in hindsight. And yet, because it unfolded slowly and quietly, it went unchecked. Everyone saw something. Everyone noticed. No one acted fast enough. By 1993, Elisa Izquierdo's small body was beginning to carry the story she could not fully speak aloud. Teachers noticed bruises in places no child should ever be marked. Soft skin darkened under sleeves, faint welts across her legs, occasional discoloration on her tiny arms. They asked gentle questions, leaned close, and listened. And in the quiet of a classroom corner, Elisa finally found the words she had been holding inside. She had been beaten, she had been locked in a cabinet. Her voice trembled. Pause. She looked around, as if afraid that saying it out loud might make the punishment return immediately. Reports were filed with child welfare authorities, and follow-up visits were scheduled. But those visits yielded little change. Social workers noted her bruises, took statements, and then left, leaving her in the very place the marks had come from. Protection existed in theory, in files and forms, but not in the spaces she occupied day after day. Elisa's behavior began to shift under the weight of what she endured. Where once she had run eagerly to join classmates, she now hesitated at the edge of the playground. Laughter that had come freely was measured and cautious. She flinched at unexpected touches, her small hands instinctively curling against herself, and she avoided eye contact with adults she did not yet trust. Each bruise became a language of its own, a silent plea carried in the subtle arch of her back, in the way she drew her knees up while sitting, in the way she held her voice low. The classroom became a paradox, a place of learning and an arena of hidden pain. Teachers noticed, but what they saw was always fragments. A shy glance, a flinch, a quiet child sitting alone. Outside the walls of the school, the patterns of abuse continued uninterrupted, invisible to those who might have intervened. Elisa tried to tell them every way she could, with words soft and hesitant, spilling out in the only moments she dared. With bruises, each one an unspoken testament to harm she could not yet stop. With silence, heavy and deliberate, when fear made speech impossible. And yet, despite all the signs, despite all the attempts to be heard, the world outside the classroom remained largely unaware. The danger persisted. The signals were clear. The child who carried so much in her small body still had no one to fully see her, to fully understand, to fully protect her. Elisa had found a voice in the markings on her skin, in her withdrawn glances, in the quiet of her being. And for now, that voice was all she had. By 1994, Elisa Izquierdo's small body was beginning to tell a story that words alone could not convey. Nights were the hardest. She would wake, cold and trembling, her sheets soaked from bedwetting. During the day, she struggled to control her bowels, a silent signal that fear had already claimed her body. Each accident left her flushed with shame, hiding beneath blankets or clothes, trying desperately to erase what had happened, as though secrecy could undo the harm. Doctors began to notice subtle, disturbing signs. Bruises appeared in places that begged questions. Faint welts on her arms, discoloration on her thighs, marks older than the last visit. Medical staff asked questions, observed, documented, but the explanations they received were partial, fragmented. Trauma responses, her withdrawal, hesitation, even flinches at routine touch, were often misinterpreted as misbehavior rather than the echo of repeated violence. To Elisa, every look from an adult, every instruction, carried a tension she could not yet name. Her father, Gustavo Izquierdo, watched in growing despair. He had always been her protector, her safe haven, but he could see her retreating further into herself. Her eyes, once bright and curious, now often darted nervously. Her small hands clutched toys a little too tightly, as if to ground herself in something familiar. Gustavo pleaded with social workers. He brought documentation, detailed observations, and calls for help. He tried to reclaim the protection Elisa had once known, to restore the safety that had been stripped away, but every attempt was met with delay, bureaucracy, or assumptions that things were under control. The weight of fear and trauma was already evident in the smallest moments. A shiver when someone entered the room, a tense tightening of muscles at sudden noise, a whispered request to be left alone. Her body spoke in ways that were impossible to ignore for anyone paying close attention, but too often, attention was fleeting, insufficient. Each day without intervention allowed the abuse to embed itself deeper, and the small, fragile vessel of her body bore the marks. Elisa's frame, once full of energy and light, had begun to fold under the constant pressure of fear. Her body cried out in ways her words could not keep pace with. Every bruise, every accident, every tense movement was a message. She was in danger. Her body was crying for help long before her voice failed. And yet, for all the warnings she carried, the world outside remained unaware, leaving a child to navigate horror in silence. In the early months of 1995, the case of Elisa Izquierdo had reached a point that should have triggered immediate intervention. Her mother, Awilda Lopez, spoke openly to a social worker, a confession delivered with a chilling pride. She described in detail the punishments inflicted on her 6-year-old daughter, how she struck her, confined her in a cabinet, and imposed control over her body and will. Each word hung in the air, heavy, concrete, undeniable. This was not a passing remark. This was an admission, a verbal map of abuse that no child should ever endure. In the office, papers shuffled. Notes were taken. Protocols were observed. Forms were completed and filed. And then nothing changed. There was no emergency removal. No urgent visit to safeguard Elisa. No hand reached out to rescue the child whose suffering had just been documented in living detail. The machinery of bureaucracy moved, but it moved like a river slowed by unseen barriers, where danger continued to flow unchecked. Elisa, of course, had no idea that her mother had confessed. To her, each day remained a negotiation of survival. She continued to tiptoe through the home, flinching at voices, bracing for the next blow, retreating into corners when tension spiked. Her small body carried bruises, but her mind carried a growing fear that there was no safe place, even among adults whose role should have been protection. Her father, Gustavo, sensed the widening gap between risk and action. He had tried before, pleading, documenting, following up, but each attempt met with indifference or delay. Now, with Awilda's confession officially on record, the silence of intervention was deafening. For those who could have acted decisively, the danger was reduced to a series of forms, a stack of papers in an office, a report checked off a list. For Elisa, it meant the abuse continued uninterrupted, each day layering fear and injury upon the last. The social worker, bound by procedure, may have recorded the details meticulously, yet the human element, the urgency of a living child at risk, was lost in translation. The office walls absorbed the confession, and the world outside continued unaware. No alarms sounded. No rescue came. The danger, now fully documented, became a bureaucratic artifact rather than a catalyst for action. Every word of admission should have been a call to arms. Instead, it became a quiet echo in the files of a system that had failed to act when every second mattered. The 6-year-old girl continued to endure punishment, isolation, and terror, while adults in positions of responsibility watched her suffering from the safe distance of paper and policy. When abuse is confessed, and still nothing happens, the question is unavoidable and haunting. What is the system for? And in the shadow of that question, Elisa lived on, trapped in the home of her abuser, counting days, bruises, and the ever-lengthening silence that should have been protection. Each day passed with the invisible message that her suffering, documented and undeniable, was insufficient to provoke action. The confession existed. The record existed. The child existed. And yet, the gap between words and protection widened, leaving one small girl to navigate a nightmare that could have been stopped at any moment. In the spring of 1994, a fragile thread of hope appeared in Elisa Izquierdo's life. For the first time in years, she entered a space that felt entirely separate from fear. Enrolled in a private school by her father, Gustavo, the walls around her were bright, filled with sunlight and the quiet hum of learning. The scent of polished wood and open books replaced the acrid smell of the apartment she had come to know all too well. Here, laughter was safe, not a precursor to punishment, and the smiles of teachers were consistent, gentle, and unthreatening. For a few short months, Elisa could breathe. She ran along hallways lined with colorful drawings, her small fingers brushing the smooth surfaces of desks and bookshelves as though feeling the possibility of a different world. She raised her hand in class without flinching, spoke to classmates without hesitation, and allowed herself the small joys of childhood, chasing a ball, trading whispered secrets, laughing freely. The contrast between this world and the one at home was so stark that it almost felt unreal. It was during this period that a remarkable benefactor, Prince Michael of Greece, became aware of her situation. He offered financial support, a lifeline that could have extended her brief sanctuary into a lasting escape. To Elisa, who had never known a world without fear, this felt like a storybook come to life. She could imagine herself growing, learning, thriving, without the constant shadow of violence pressing upon her small shoulders. In those rare moments, hope was tangible. It wrapped around her like a warm blanket, and for a child who had known almost nothing but pain, it was intoxicating. Yet the fairy tale was fragile. Awilda Lopez, asserting her control, returned Elisa to the home she had once fled in spirit, removing her from the private school without delay. The safe walls, the caring teachers, the friends she had begun to trust, all were taken away. The abruptness of the transition was a shock. One moment, sunlight bathed her in warmth and possibility. The next, she was back in the dim apartment, where fear waited like a familiar shadow. Elisa's small body had learned patterns of anticipation and dread. Now those lessons intensified. Her eyes, which had sparkled with cautious joy, dimmed as she stepped back into the space that demanded silence, that punished curiosity, that transformed hope into another form of tension. She remembered the hallways, the laughter, the books, the kind hands that had lifted her from despair, and the loss of it was sharp, physical, like a door closing on her chest. The contrast between what could have been and the reality she returned to was almost unbearable. For a fleeting moment, she had glimpsed safety, had touched the possibility of a future not defined by bruises, isolation, or fear. She had run along corridors that promised growth, laughed in classrooms that nurtured her mind, and imagined a life where love and care were constants rather than luxuries. And then it was gone. Elisa was close enough to safety to almost touch it. That closeness made the removal from school even more devastating. The fairy tale of a better life had existed, if only briefly, and its absence became another layer of the life she had no choice but to endure. In that brief window, she had felt the warmth of protection, the gentle attention of adults who saw her, and the possibility that childhood could be gentle. But the door to that world closed, leaving her with memory, longing, and the cruel reminder that, for now, she remained trapped in a home where danger was constant and hope had to be fleeting. By July 1994, Elisa Izquierdo had already endured a lifetime's worth of fear in her 6 short years. Yet, through it all, there had been one constant: her father, Gustavo. He was more than a parent. He was her shield, her advocate, the anchor in a world that had offered her almost nothing but danger. His arms had been a place where bruises and fears could, for a moment, be set aside. His voice had been the calm in the storm, insisting that she was loved, insisting that she was seen. For Elisa, Gustavo was proof that protection existed, even if only fleetingly. Then, suddenly, that protection vanished. Gustavo's death was abrupt, a cruel fracture in the fragile structure of her life. One morning, the 6-year-old awoke to the absence of the man who had always fought for her. The apartment, once tense even under his presence, now felt hollow and suffocating. His shoes still sat by the door, his coat hanging silently, a stark reminder that the person who had once moved mountains to defend her was gone. Alone with her mother, Awilda, and the volatile presence of her stepfather, Carlos, Elisa's world contracted. The small spaces of the apartment, once merely uncomfortable, now became prisons. Shadows carried threats. Every creak of the floorboard or sudden slam of a door sent her heart racing. The quiet corners that she had once used to hide her tears became refuges for whispered sobs, and the simple act of breathing without flinching felt impossible. Her grief was immediate, raw, and physical. Tears ran freely, often unnoticed, as she clutched toys or the corner of a blanket, pressing them to her chest as if their presence could replace the warmth and safety of her father. Nights stretched long, filled with imagined threats and the absence of his comforting voice. Each sound in the apartment, a cough, a step, a raised voice, was magnified, a reminder that the one person who had consistently intervened was no longer there. Even the authorities, who had begun to notice signs of abuse, remained hesitant. Reports were filed, observations made, but without Gustavo's advocacy, urgency faltered. Social workers called, forms were checked, and visits were scheduled, but action lagged behind the growing danger. For Elisa, the absence of her father's voice meant the absence of immediate rescue. The warnings that had once been bolstered by his insistence were now just words on a page. The loss of Gustavo marked a turning point. No longer did a steady, loving presence intervene between her and the escalating violence. Her small body, already carrying years of bruises and fear, now bore the added weight of grief and abandonment. Her mind, once able to cling to hope and occasional moments of joy, now teetered under the knowledge that the one person who could fight for her was gone. The apartment, the shadows, the walls, they became a reminder that safety was no longer possible. Every day was measured, every movement calculated, every word weighed. The protective bubble that had existed, however briefly, was shattered. The one person who had fought for her was gone. And in the absence of Gustavo, Elisa Izquierdo was left alone. Small, vulnerable and unshielded. In a home where the danger she had feared for years was now unchallenged, inching ever closer to the irreparable. On March 14, 1995, an anonymous letter arrived at the Manhattan Child Welfare Authorities. Its words were urgent, stark, and unmistakable. A 6-year-old girl, Elisa Izquierdo, was being confined in a dark room for hours. Her hair had been forcibly cut. She was isolated. Her small body and spirit were subjected to punishments that no child should ever endure. Someone outside her home had noticed. Someone who saw the warning signs that the adults closest to her had failed to protect. In the apartment, Elisa went about her day, small and vigilant, unaware that someone had tried to speak for her. The walls, dim and suffocating, absorbed her whispered pleas and stifled sobs. Her hair, unevenly shorn in cruel punishment, tickled the back of her neck, a constant reminder of control and humiliation. The tiny room she occupied became both refuge and trap, a place where she huddled silently, flinching at every movement, every raised voice, every step in the hallway. The letter reached its destination in an office miles away. It was logged, stamped, filed. The report was classified as unsubstantiated, a label that reduced urgency to a bureaucratic term. No home visit followed. No social worker appeared at the apartment door to see her eyes, to feel the tension in the air, to verify the words that screamed from paper onto reality. There was no immediate removal. No hands reached out to protect a child whose life depended on quick action. In her home, the abuse continued uninterrupted. The small acts of cruelty, confinement, forced isolation, the constant surveillance of her mother and stepfather, carved deeper into her spirit. Every room held reminders of fear. Every corner whispered danger. And outside the apartment, the world remained oblivious. The letter, intended as a lifeline, had become nothing more than a folder in a filing cabinet, the urgency of its contents ignored, the child it sought to protect invisible to those entrusted with her safety. Elisa, for her part, carried on in silence. She learned to mask her suffering, curling into shadows, whispering when necessary, hiding her body and emotions in ways a child should never have to. Each passing hour without intervention reinforced that the adults who could save her, those mandated to act, were absent, inert, or distracted by procedure. Her body bore the marks of violence, her mind the creeping dread of invisibility, and her small heart the understanding that cries alone were insufficient. The warning existed. The plea was documented. But for Elisa it made no difference. The words that could have sparked rescue were folded, filed, and shelved, leaving her in the apartment where fear was constant, punishment ongoing, and hope increasingly fragile. The warning was written down and then filed away. And in that gap between acknowledgement and action, a child's suffering continued unabated, inching closer to a tragedy that could have been stopped. By the summer of 1995, the fragile threads holding Elisa Izquierdo's life together were unraveling faster than anyone could notice, or care to intervene. Awilda Lopez, whose brief periods of sobriety had offered fragile hope, had relapsed fully into crack cocaine. The apartment, already tight and oppressive, seemed to shrink with each passing day. The air was thick with tension, the scent of smoke and chemicals mingling with the faint odor of neglect. Nights stretched endlessly, punctuated by arguments, heavy footsteps, and the sudden, unpredictable violence that had become routine in her home. Into this environment came Carlos Lopez, Awilda's new partner. Unlike Gustavo, who had nurtured and protected her, Carlos brought instability and further danger. He was a man accustomed to chaos, a drug user whose presence magnified fear rather than reduced it. Together, he and Awilda transformed the apartment into a crucible of terror. Elisa, just 6 years old, learned quickly how to navigate this minefield, when to stay silent, where to hide, and how to make herself small in a world that offered her no safety. The neighbors began to notice. Behind thin walls and closed doors, the sounds of horror seeped outward. Screams pierced the corridors. "Mommy, please stop. I'm sorry." The cries were repeated, desperate, relentless. A child begging for mercy in a city filled with people, many of whom might have cared, but none who intervened. Reports may have been filed, calls logged, and yet no decisive action came. The system that was supposed to protect her had become invisible, its silence deafening. Inside, Elisa's suffering intensified. Bruises multiplied across her body, some hidden beneath clothing, some unavoidable. Burns, cuts, and marks of confinement became her constant companions. Her small frame bore the physical proof of relentless punishment, while her mind, already fragile from the loss of her father, carried the weight of isolation and terror. Emotional collapse followed each episode of abuse. She withdrew, learned to mask pain, and whispered her suffering into corners where it might go unnoticed. Even in moments when she longed to cry out, fear tightened her throat. The apartment itself became a character in her nightmare. Every creaking floorboard, every slamming door, every shadow on the wall was a signal to move cautiously, to anticipate danger, to survive. She memorized the patterns of threats, counting steps, timing her breaths, listening for footsteps. Each sound could be a herald of punishment, each silence a warning that violence might come without notice. Outside, the authorities remained distant. Calls were recorded. Visits may have been scheduled. But none of this touched the reality inside Elisa's apartment. The walls, thin and permeable, were witnesses to horror, but no hands reached through them. No voices demanded accountability. Her screams, though audible beyond the threshold, were met with inaction. The world outside was present only as paperwork, a system where urgency was absent and a child's life was filtered through forms and bureaucratic procedure. Yet through it all Elisa continued. She learned to move quietly, to bend without breaking, to exist in the small spaces that offered minimal reprieve. Her mind developed strategies to survive. She counted tiles on the floor, memorized the position of furniture, and sought out corners where she could hide her bruises from prying eyes. Small acts of resilience emerged in silence, in observation, in the delicate balance between fear and fleeting hope. But the danger escalated relentlessly. The one barrier that might have shielded her, Gustavo, her father, was gone. And now, in this apartment filled with violence and neglect, her suffering was unchallenged, unchecked, and unending. The walls were thin. The silence from authorities was louder. And within those walls, Elisa Izquierdo endured horrors no child should ever know, trapped in a home where every day measured her fear and tested the fragile resilience of a 6-year-old who had already learned too much about pain. It was November 22, 1995, a date that would mark the final chapter of 6-year-old Elisa Izquierdo's short life. The city outside the apartment continued its hum, indifferent to the storm of fear and suffering inside. Elisa's small body, already battered and broken by months of relentless abuse, finally succumbed to exhaustion. She collapsed onto the threadbare mattress in the dimly lit room, a tiny figure trembling with pain, confusion, and terror. Her breathing was shallow. Her bruised limbs hung limply at her sides. The burns, cuts, and marks that crisscrossed her skin were silent testimony to the horror she had endured. Yet no one was near to offer comfort, care, or intervention. Hours of relentless suffering had led to this moment. And yet, in the minds of those entrusted with her safety, the urgency of the situation had not registered. Awilda Lopez, instead of calling for an ambulance, reached for her sister, Mercy Torres, dialing the number with casual familiarity. She described her daughter in chillingly detached terms. "She's like retarded on the bed. Fluid coming out of her nose and mouth." Mercy, alarmed, urged her to call for medical help immediately, to get someone to the apartment before it was too late. But Awilda refused. No one came. The child, whose every breath should have demanded swift action, remained untreated, left alone in the apartment where danger had long been constant. Outside, the city pressed on. Car engines roared, streetlights flickered, distant sirens wailed. Yet inside the apartment, silence dominated. Not the comforting kind, but the oppressive, suffocating silence of neglect and inaction. Every tick of the clock echoed Elisa's vulnerability. Every shadow in the small room became a threat. Her eyes, once bright with curiosity and warmth, stared blankly at the ceiling, tracing cracks that seemed to mirror the fractures in her short life. She spent the night alive, trapped in the fragile border between life and death. Her small chest rose and fell with each strained breath, but no hand reached to soothe her pain. No voice whispered words of comfort. Her suffering, accumulated over 6 years, had now condensed into these final, long hours. Elisa's body, her heart, and her spirit were silently pleading for someone, anyone, to intervene. But the apartment remained locked in a grim routine of fear, and the world outside remained unaware of the desperate struggle for life within. Through the darkness, Elisa waited, her innocence still present, her hope still flickering despite everything. She had endured so much already, and now, in the last hours of her life, she waited for salvation that never came. The night stretched endlessly, and with each passing moment, the fragile thread holding her existence in place grew thinner. By morning, the world would finally see the consequences of inaction, but for Elisa, the wait ended in silence. She spent her final hours alive, waiting. The morning of November 23, 1995, arrived over Manhattan gray and cold, the city moving on as if unaware that within a small apartment in the heart of the borough, tragedy had already been sealed. Outside, footsteps echoed on the pavement, distant horns honked, and the hum of everyday life carried on. Inside, the apartment was suffused with a silence that was almost tactile, a heavy, oppressive stillness that pressed against the walls, against the floorboards, against the tiny frame of a girl who had spent her life trapped in fear. It was the neighbor who first crossed the threshold into that quiet horror. Drawn by the echoes of pain that had long filtered through the thin walls, they hesitated for a heartbeat, sensing that what awaited inside might be more than any person could bear. And then they saw her. Elisa Izquierdo lay unmoving on the mattress, her body rigid, pale, and silent. Her small hands were curled, her bruised arms and legs exposed to the dim morning light, revealing the cruel marks of months of torment. Burns that spoke of deliberate cruelty, deep purple bruises that told of repeated blows, and tiny scars that whispered stories of confinement and fear. The faint smell of smoke mingled with bleach, an acrid reminder of a home that had been cleansed in surface but not in care. The neighbor's instinctive horror led to a quick call. 911. Sirens would cut through the city within minutes, but even as they raced toward the apartment, it was already too late. Elisa's body had endured more than any child could bear. Each paramedic, each officer worked with precision, but their hands could not undo months of cruelty. They could not breathe life back into a child whose heart and body had been pushed to their limits. Awilda Lopez stood nearby, her composure eerie and disquieting. She threatened self-harm, her voice calm yet hollow, a jarring counterpoint to the vivid suffering of the child. When questioned, she recounted matter-of-factly how she had hurled Elisa headfirst into a concrete wall. The officers listened, their expressions frozen between disbelief and professional detachment, while the neighbor watched, trembling, unable to comprehend the depth of the horror before them. Investigators moved carefully through the apartment, taking note of the signs of prolonged abuse. Discarded toys, soiled sheets, dark corners that seemed almost purpose-built for confinement. Every object, every detail became evidence of a life stolen, of a child's world twisted into a prison. Even the air seemed heavy with the echoes of screams that had long gone unanswered. Outside, The city continued its indifferent rhythm. The juxtaposition was almost unbearable. Pedestrians walking their dogs, a school bus rounding the corner, a delivery truck rumbling past. Mundane, ordinary, utterly unaware of the profound loss just walls away. Inside, the apartment bore witness to a childhood erased, a life extinguished while the world slept on. By the time help arrived, it was already too late. Elisa Izquierdo's 6 years of life, marked by fleeting joy and prolonged suffering, had ended in the silence that had defined her final night. Her story, seared into the memories of those who witnessed her final hours, became a lasting indictment of the failures surrounding her. Reports ignored, warnings dismissed, cries unheard. These were the echoes that would haunt the city long after her body was gone. In that small apartment, every shadow, every scar, every silent object told a story. The world finally saw what had been happening behind closed doors for far too long. And yet, the profound question lingered, echoing through the hearts of all who learned her story. How could a child endure so much and no one stop it? Elisa Izquierdo was gone. But the memory of her suffering, her resilience, and the systemic failures that allowed it would not be forgotten. The autopsy room was cold, sterile, and unyielding, its fluorescent lights casting sharp shadows on metal tables and tile floors. Here, in this clinical environment, the truth about Elisa Izquierdo's life and death was laid bare with an unflinching clarity that no narrative or testimony could fully capture. On November 24, 1995, pathologists began the painstaking examination, uncovering details that spoke to a lifetime of suffering condensed into just 6 years. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, the final blow that extinguished the life of a child whose existence had already been defined by relentless torment. But the report revealed far more than the last, fatal moment. It chronicled the years of abuse that had scarred her small body. Broken bones riddled her frame, some healed imperfectly, others fresh, testament to repeated violence. Jagged burns scarred her skin, cruelly inflicted and left to mark the innocence of her flesh. Internal injuries spoke of relentless assaults that had gone unseen, untended, and unchallenged. The findings also included evidence of sexual abuse, a revelation that underscored the depths of cruelty she had endured. Each mark, each fracture, each scar was not simply a medical observation. It was a story etched into her body, a record of neglect, pain, and fear that the world had largely ignored. These were the physical echoes of screams that had been silenced too early, and of a childhood stolen piece by piece. Even seasoned law enforcement officials, long accustomed to human suffering, were shaken. One veteran investigator, reflecting later, admitted that in more than 2 decades on the force, he had never encountered a case so extreme, so layered with cruelty, so horrifying in its duration and scope. The autopsy made it abundantly clear. This was not a single act of violence. This was a sustained, relentless campaign of abuse, a lifetime of suffering that had ended in the cruelest finality. The sterile surroundings of the morgue contrasted starkly with the innocence Elisa had once known. In life she had laughed, played, and trusted the world. In death, her body bore the evidence of betrayal by those charged with protecting her. The contrast was staggering. A little girl who had once been her father's princess, whose teachers had marveled at her warmth and gentle nature, now reduced to a collection of injuries and forensic notes. Every detail in the report was a damning testament to systemic failure. Warnings ignored, letters dismissed, observations unacted upon. All were reflected in the lines and fractures of her body. Each injury, meticulously catalogued, forced those who read the report to confront the horror of inaction, the devastating consequences of a world that had turned a blind eye. The conclusion was haunting in its simplicity and starkness. This wasn't one moment of violence, it was a lifetime of it. Every bruise, burn, and broken bone told the story of prolonged suffering, of innocence exploited, and of a system that had failed at every turn. And yet, beneath the clinical language, beneath the forensic precision, lay the human truth. Elisa Izquierdo had lived a life of fear, pain, and relentless abuse, and the world had let her down. Her story, etched in flesh and bone, was now indelible. It became a silent, unyielding testament to the cruelty she endured and a lasting reminder of the consequences when society fails to protect its most vulnerable. The autopsy did not merely reveal death. It revealed a life stolen, a childhood erased, and the urgent call for accountability that would echo long after her passing. The courtroom was packed on March 1996, a crisp spring morning in Manhattan. The air carried a tension so thick it seemed to press down on everyone present. Family members, reporters, law enforcement, and strangers alike, drawn by the horrific story of a 6-year-old girl whose life had ended in violence. Inside, the polished wood benches reflected the faces of people who carried grief, disbelief, and the need for justice in equal measure. Awilda Lopez, once a figure of chaos in a child's fragile world, now sat in a courtroom under the gaze of the law. The judge, seasoned and stern, listened as Lopez admitted her guilt, pleading guilty to second-degree murder. Her confession was matter-of-fact, almost detached, leaving the room to absorb the weight of a life destroyed and a childhood stolen. The sentencing followed swiftly. 15 years to life imprisonment. The judge's words echoed far beyond the walls of the courtroom, but his condemnation did not stop at Awilda Lopez. He tore into the failures of the child welfare system, calling out every missed warning, every ignored report, every inaction that allowed the abuse to escalate unchecked. The officers in the room, many of whom had investigated the case firsthand, nodded grimly, acknowledging the depth of systemic failure. Outside, the public reacted with outrage and disbelief. The newspapers ran stark headlines, and citizens demanded answers, petitions, and reform. Yet for all the justice that was finally served in court, it could never return the life taken, nor could it erase the trauma Elisa endured. The courtroom became a theater of reflection, a space where sorrow met accountability, and where society briefly confronted the consequences of indifference. For those who had witnessed the case from the outside, it was a bitter reminder that Elisa had justice in court, but not in life. Time moves differently when grief lingers. Decades passed. Lawsuits faded into archives. Headlines were replaced by news stories. Yet the shadow of Elisa Izquierdo's death remained, a haunting reminder of a system's failure. Her mother, Awilda Lopez, remained behind bars, her parole requests repeatedly denied. Each denial was met with quiet relief by the public, a collective exhale for the child who could no longer defend herself. Then came April 19, 2022. Parole board granted Lopez release. The news ignited a firestorm. Families, advocates, and survivors demanded answers. How could the woman who took a child's life, who had left a scar on a city's conscience, walk free? Social media lit up with outrage. Editorials questioned accountability, forgiveness, and the very meaning of justice. The decision forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths, that justice delayed is not always justice served, and that some consequences cannot be measured in years behind bars. Lopez's release became a mirror reflecting society's moral tension, between punishment and the possibility of redemption, between remembering Elisa and moving forward. For those who loved Elisa, and for a city still haunted by the echoes of her suffering, she remained forever 6 years old. A child whose story demanded that her memory be more than a statistic, that her life be a lesson carved into the collective conscience. Elisa Izquierdo's life was tragically brief, yet its impact has been profound. In the years following her death, reforms in the child welfare system were initiated, some even bearing her name, as a testament to the necessity of vigilance and care. Social workers, investigators, and legislators began to confront the gaps that had allowed her abuse to continue unchecked. Yet even as the laws changed, the work remains unfinished. Across cities and towns, children continue to fall through the cracks, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to act. Elisa's story became a symbol, a reminder of the fragile line between protection and neglect, between vigilance and indifference. Her memory is etched not just in statutes or reports, but in the hearts of those who mourned her, who fought for her, and who still question the systems that failed her. She is a 6-year-old who never grew up, a child whose innocence was stolen, whose story endures as a warning, a call to conscience, and a demand for accountability. And so, We are left with the question that echoes long after the headlines fade. How many Elisas are out there right now, waiting for someone to listen?